Welcome to our Governance and Priorities meeting for Monday, July 6th, 2020. And welcome. What a great day it is, been in our community. And just a kind of note of acknowledgement. Last Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, a lot of volunteers from the community went out and about with a donation from Jordan Chi of the Jordan Chi from Century 21 Masters Realty that donated the Canada flags, and a Canada flag was placed in every lawn in town Stony Plain. So again, that was a great thing to wake up to. And it was very, very well received by residents. So excellent job to the members that were part of the committee to get it going, and to all the volunteers that made it happen. Thank you very much. Okay, with that, Councillor Loy, please.
Thank you, Worship. No, just a point of clarification there. It was Century 21 Masters that made the donation, and it was all the realtors that work out of this particular office were the ones who bought the flags and contributed them. Jordan just happened to be the coordinating person there, so it's all the people that work for that particular office that bought the flags. Just for point of clarity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Loy. And yes, so thank you to Century 21 Masters Realty then. Okay, with that, members of council, you have an agenda before you. Administration, anything to add to the agenda today?
No, Your Worship.
Thank you, Town Manager. And moving on to Deputy Mayor, if I can have you make the motion, please.
She forgot.
I forgot I was Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I move that Town Council adopt the July 6, 2020 Governance and Priorities meeting agenda as presented.
Okay. Thank you very much. And again, as in previous couple of meetings, if you're not in attendance, if you can just text me your vote. Okay, so that's just a motion to adopt the agenda as presented. So all those that are opposed. Okay, seeing none, that is carried. Okay, moving on to number 2 is the adoption is done. Number 3 is the public input session. Town Manager, was there any written submissions or emails that came through to administrative staff that needed to be read out to council?
No, Your Worship. We did not receive anything.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we'll move on to presentations and delegations. There are none. Moving on to business items. Number 5 is, the first one is 5.1, debt management. So go ahead, administration.
Thank you, Your Worship. I believe our General Manager of Corporate Services will provide council with an information update and overview of the proposed policy.
Thank you. Good evening, Council. We are here tonight to present the first strategy in our fiscal sustainability framework, being debt management. So tonight's objectives are just to remind Council of the legislative, strategic, and best practices for debt management. And then we're looking for endorsement and comment on the proposed approach, which includes both the principles for the debt management, which will be included in the fiscal sustainability framework, as well as the debt management policy updates. So we'll start with the fiscal sustainability principles that are applicable to debt. So there's 4 main principles that we have identified that you see in front of you here tonight. I think it's important to note that some of these principles, do play against one another. And so I would, for an example of that, say the flexibility that, we sometimes require for future projects to be funded by debt, as well as the sustainability. Can we afford these? Will sometimes, be opposing or on the other side of the equitability principle of, how is this going to be paid for? Who's going to benefit for these capital projects, which is debt funded, and the debt servicing costs as well. And then the last principle would be just that debt is always taken, and I think the town has done a really good job of this in the past, and with the strategic planning process and the corporate plan process, that the debt is tied to those projects, and so that the council as well as the public understands where those funds will be applied. So I think these are fairly straightforward. It's just looking at them, standing back, and the intent of these principles going forward would be that as we look to future projects and how they're going to be funded via debt, some of these would be included in the analysis that administration brings forward with some additional comments on the specific project. But I like the question that they frame, and it makes us all pause and think about the answer. And there's not always a straightforward answer, but I think the discussion between council and the public and administration is the important piece, that we make the right decisions on what should be debt funded and what does that look like going into the future. So then moving into more the debt policy side, some of you that have been on council for a while may remember this, that it's really a balancing act between three prongs, being legislative compliance, best practices, and strategic intent, really for any of the fiscal policies. And so in this case, the debt management policy is really weighted towards the legislative compliance because there are definite requireds there through the Municipal Government Act. And there's always best practices, but there is some of the council discretion and the strategic intent as to, do we want to change from those legislative requirements? The debt limit being a good example of that. Is council comfortable with that, or do they want to give some different direction at a different level, which would be a little bit more strategic? So just running through as a reminder, the legislative compliance on the Municipal Government Act side, the debt limit on the total debt and the debt servicing, which is the debt principal and interest, is limited by the MGA at 1.5 times revenue for the total debt and 0.25 or 25% of revenue on the debt servicing side. That it gives some room for municipalities. When you think of if our revenues and expenditures typically equate. So 25% of our expenses on the debt servicing side does give us some room there for sure. And we typically are quite low in comparison to those Municipal Government Act limits. The MGA also specifies that we're required to do any borrowing by bylaw. And if it's longer than 5 years, it has to be advertised to the public. The borrowing has to be tied to a purpose, and that's specified in the bylaw, and it must be in place before the start of construction. So, as an example, if we decide, maybe we should borrow some money for downtown, the MGA would not allow that because the project is already in progress. The debt needs to be identified, the bylaw needs to be in place before the project begins, and that's MGA specified. And then the final piece is just that, I think this one is common sense, so it makes sense to most people that the term of the borrowing cannot exceed the life of the capital property. So we don't want to be paying for assets that may no longer be in use. So, a building, the life of that is 40 to 50 years, so you wouldn't borrow longer than that. I think, that makes sense without, even if it wasn't in the MGA. So that really places the firm limits around debt and borrowing, and it's really up to council whether we wanted to adjust those or not, and that's really where the policy piece comes in. Best practices for debt management. We believe that we've covered all of these within the policy presented before you tonight. So the parties responsible for the implementation is obviously CAO and administration, and the duties are within the policy, and the oversight and approval of any debt would reside with council. Conditions and purposes for debt, where it can be issued. So the policy, directly says we will not borrow for operating purposes. It places some limit on the maturity. It talks about intergenerational equity or distributing those costs appropriately. There's the debt limits within, which within the current policy is those MGA limits. The internal borrowing, so we have seen a couple of those over the past couple of years, and that was in the policy previously, and it remains as to how those internal borrows should be done and the interest that is attributed to those. And then the last three, the link to the long-term capital planning, reporting, and review of policy, I think are fairly standard, but good practices. So proposed changes to the policy within your package tonight on page 8. We noted sort of the larger changes that we have made to the policy. The policy hasn't been changed since 2013. So there was, there's a lot of good examples of policies out there, and we were trying to just get the wording as crisp as we could. So we updated some of the purpose and the statement for clarity and added some definitions and headings just to hopefully make it a little bit easier and clearer. It's amazing when you look at them a second time, you just want it to be as clear as you can and comparable to others as well. We have linked it to the fiscal sustainability framework. So these two pieces will tie together. Added the responsibilities explicitly within the policy. I think they were implied before, but hopefully this will just be a little clearer. And we've added some considerations under the length of the debt term. So in the past, the policy sort of pointed to that most borrowing would be done over a 20-year period. So we would repay over the next 20 years once we pull the debt. And we've just added some additional considerations so that, there's thought and consideration, which I think was always being done, just not documented this way in the policy. So just added some clarity around that. And then we have removed just the term or the financing pointed to Alberta Capital Financing Authority or ACFA. In the past, they have just provided superior rates because it's government backed for the municipality to borrow at. So it made sense to always borrow through them. But the province in their last budget announced that they were disbanding this organization. So we have been notified by them. I mean, they're working through their process, and it sounds like that's going to be over a number of years. And I'm assuming we'll still be able to borrow through some sort of provincial process. And we'll understand that as we get closer to borrowing some new debt. But just remove that for the policy perspective. And I think it's administration's intent and to always go out and look for the best rates that we could get for the town to make sure that we're minimizing the debt servicing costs around that. And in the past, the big corporate banks had trouble competing with ACFA, but I know they are figuring out how to structure that debt too, so that their rates are much more comparable, as well as they're providing some flexibility on repayment. Because in the past, ACFA has really not allowed you to repay, or the penalties were so great we wouldn't repay debt early, whereas some of the banks have figured out how to kind of allow some flexibility. So on some projects that makes sense, that we there may be future revenues that we're expecting and we want to repay the debt, so those things the policy just allows us to look at those and structure with the appropriate lender. And then we have added debt categories, just breaking out the tax-funded debt from the utility-funded debt. So currently, all the town's debt is tax-supported, but we know that we have a couple of large utility projects coming at us in the next couple of years. And it's, again, just the best practice that those are separated out. So have added that to the policy for council consideration. And I think it really just shows where the future funding source for the debt is coming from. Is it the tax base, and are we going to need to increase tax base, or are we going to need to increase utility user rates, which are typically the two funding sources for debt. So the other piece that we looked at was just around the debt limit. I know we've talked a little bit with council about it in some of the corporate planning processes in the past about what, and really we wanted to look at what the region was doing too. So on page 9 of your lead sheet, you can see that where Stony Plain fell in relation to the EMRB partners, and which was really the median of the group. So we are utilizing 38% of the provincial limit, which was right dab in the smack dab in the middle. So right in the middle. The other thing we looked at for the municipalities was if they had put in a different limit from the provincial limit. And you can see in the attachment that 10 out of 12 had done that. And sort of that varied all over anywhere from 50 to 85%. I would say most were sort of in that 75 to 85, sort of the higher end of that range. They put in an internal limit, which they're monitoring below the provincial limit. So we calculated what that may look like for the town, just to give council a good, a visual and understand the numbers of what that could look like. And that's also included in your package. And when we broke out the tax from the utility supported debt with the 80% limit, that utility supported debt is the one that we looked at, and it was like, we know there's some big capital projects coming there. So that's why we have not included a lower limit within the policy for council's consideration tonight, but look forward to hearing any comments you may have around that. I think, internal limits is one thing that it may give some flexibility into the future, but it also is something that council could change at any time. So I guess, there's no perfect answer to it, but I guess that's where our recommendation is coming forth tonight. So that really wraps up just the highlights on the policy and the framework. And I'll just quickly walk you through sort of next steps on the framework of where we are and where we're heading, so we all stay together. So next up on the agenda, we have the cash management and investment update, which also relates to the fiscal sustainability. And then, pending council discussion tonight, we're hoping to bring back the policies at the next meeting for final approval, so that we can get those approved before the summer break and we don't all forget what we've talked about. But that could be flexible depending on feedback. And then in the fall, we'll come back in September and October with a utility self-sustaining strategy, capital funding strategy, and an asset management update. And then at that time, we'll sort of look at phase 2, structure that out, and give council some more detail around timing and specifics around that. That's all that I had to present to you tonight, and I will take any questions that you may have.
No, my shortcut here doesn't work. Okay, but I just turned yours on. You want to see Jen? Oh, Jen, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. And I'll just go into members of council for any questions of clear understanding. And we'll start with Councillor Laurie. Actually, no, we'll go with Councillor Matties first, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. I've got two questions. One is related to the regional comparison of debt limit policy. So when we look at, for example, Spruce Grove has basically established a 50% of the provincial limit. The average was 80%. And then we talk about say potentially an 80% for ours, but are not including that in that, in the policy at this point. My question is with regards to some of the reasoning behind Spruce Grove and their ability to look at a 50% of the provincial limit, and what our concerns are that we wouldn't even consider for example, a 20% cushion, so as an 80% of the provincial limit.
It's a good question.
You're right, Your Worship, through to Councillor Matties. So, I mean, I can't speak too much on Spruce Grove, but I did talk to their CFO just to confirm that that was the policy still in place. I think they as well are working through a similar fiscal sustainability strategy. And I know in their last corporate plan, that was one of the things they were showing long term was, they wouldn't be able to, based on their current priorities, maintain within that internal 50% limit. So I would say they are reviewing that currently, and I would expect either they're going to adjust their priorities and do less or increase the debt limit based on, from where it is right now. So that's what I know about Spruce Grove. And really on ours, that's why, we wanted to show council what it could look like if we did put in the 80% limit. I think the other piece that I think about when we look at the internal limit is, council has to approve every debenture going forward. And I think that may be a better strategy at this time, is to understand the projects that are coming and understand the corporate plan as it comes forth to council, and either approve based on your comfort level of that, because it really is those utility projects coming, which were somewhat unexpected, that we're going to be near the top of that limit potentially to fund some of mainly the stormwater projects coming.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Matties. Does that answer your question?
Yes, may I ask a second question?
Yes, go ahead.
And William, I can't hear you very well, or Mayor
Sorry.
Choi, I cannot hear you very well.
Go ahead, Councillor Matties.
Okay, thank you. My second question is with regards to page 8 of 48. And I need to provide a little bit of explanation. So when we look at debt management, the debt management plan, we've talked about long-term planning, sustainability, and flexibility. All of those, put together, and that's discussed in the presentation. The flexibility is with regards to either emergent issues. And we've also said that flexibility is defined as an unforeseen circumstance. Well, bottom line is, when it comes to an emergent issue or an unforeseen circumstance, some of those things can be anticipated, and some of those things cannot be anticipated. And just to give you a couple of examples, if we talk about the new library, where we had building was not our responsibility, there was a cost revision and then an increase of dollars. In the central school replacement, the road infrastructure requirements, there was a change from one access to two accesses, and that ended up costing additional dollars as well. A storm pond regresses over time, and there's additional dollars that go with that. So my question is, in terms of our debt management policy, how can it provide a process to evaluate some of these emerging issues more effectively to match our needs and our funding?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Matties. General Manager. Is yours on?
You went to the general manager, didn't you?
Yeah, we're waiting for...
Your Worship, it's a CAO here. I believe those of us, online, so to speak, are having a hard time hearing from within the council chambers. I believe you have asked our General Manager of Corporate Services to comment on that question from Councillor Matties.
That is correct. Can you hear me now?
Okay. General Manager, if you want to take it from there.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through to Councillor Matties. It's a good question for sure. I think when you point out the specific projects, the things that come to my mind are some of our internal processes, which I think we are tightening up, is just, better business cases, better understanding earlier on. And, some of it is, well, it seems that it should have been known at the time. That it could be debatable on some of the projects, although I'm always an advocate of, well-defined projects, well scoped out, so we understand the costs and can adequately plan. And I think the more that the town focuses on long-term and understanding those projects and scoping them out, the better off it is. It's no other municipality would say anything different than that. But I think that's where it's maybe not so much on the funding side, but it's more on the business case and those examples that you pointed out of just, getting better at those processes and refining those as we go.
Okay. Thank you, General Manager. Appreciate that. Councillor Matties, did that answer your question?
It does. Just one follow-up comment is to try to ensure that there is something that addresses that, whether it's in this policy or somewhere else. I just feel that somehow I feel sometimes I'm in a black box because I don't have maybe all the information. Maybe it was done, but I don't know the process of how the conclusion was drawn, and then that gives us a challenge as a council to be able to ensure the interests of our community are being met.
That's a good comment, and that's exactly what our staff are doing, is to formalize a lot of those processes so that we have more accurate and better information for council to make decisions with going forward in terms of corporate planning. Thank you. We're going to Councillor Laurie, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. And thank you, General Manager, for the report and the information. I just have a couple of questions and or comments on this. First is in regards to the debt limit. And I'm just curious if you can help us understand. We have a debt limit that is imposed by the provincial government. And it is our responsibility then as council and administrative responsibility to present where we are at in that limit. So if all of our expenditures have to come to council for approval for borrowing anyways, what really is the purpose and or advantage of imposing a debt limit on our debt limit?
Okay, that is a good question and fair. General Manager, any questions and comments regarding that one?
Your Worship, through to Councillor Laurie, I think it is a good discussion to have. I mean, the limit, so council could choose a different limit if you did not agree with what the province has put in place for a limit. As a reminder, they've put in a limit as 1.5 times of revenue on the total debt and the 0.25 or 25% of revenue on debt servicing payments. So I tend to look at that debt servicing limit as probably more relevant because if we looked at, the town does have quite a bit of borrowing room available. We still could borrow up to 38 million under the provincial limit. But when I think of, what we would be paying on interest and debt repayment on that, it would be very difficult for us to fund that through either the tax base or the utility base because, residents don't want to have those large of increases that fast. So that's where we were contemplating putting the limit into the policy and had lots of internal discussion about that. But the fact that, we present the corporate plan and we're trying to stagger out those capital projects so that it is reasonable to the resident and that council would have to approve all those debentures going forward. That's where we were comfortable leaving the policy with the MGA limit currently.
Okay. Thank you very much. Councillor Laurie, does that kind of answer your question? Or do you have the follow-up?
It does, and I have a little bit of a follow-up on that. And the first comment on that is in regards to what the General Manager just stated, in that you talked about essentially what is the sustainability of that debt limit. Are we able to sustain at the level of the provincial debt limit, or not. And so I just want to understand for my own clarity from what I heard you just say. So are you advising council that you feel the provincial debt limits are sustainable for the town of Stony Plain, or you feel that the provincial debt limits are unsustainable for the town of Stony Plain and are recommending a lower debt limit?
Okay. Thank you very much, Councilor Laurie. General Manager?
Your Worship, through to Councillor Laurie. I guess I would say that the debt limits are, they're very generous from the province at this point in time of the town. I mean, I think it's the current economic situation where we know, residents and ratepayers have their own struggles will dictate how much debt we can borrow. It won't dictate how much debt, but it will impact how much we could debt servicing we will be able to fund through either the tax rate or the utility rate. So I guess it's we could put lower limits, definitely. I do worry about the utility side of that because some of that we know that there are emergent projects, which to me we may need to come back to council and say we are not within policy on the utility side. And so I don't know if that answers your question or brings some clarity to it, but that's, I guess, where the thought process was of how it is presented tonight.
Your Worship, it's a CAO here, and I can offer some comment and insight on that as well. The provincial debt limits that are imposed through the MGA are what would be considered more of a province-wide or macro attempt to ensure that municipal government as an industry as a whole does not run up significant debt load. And it's the notion that somebody is responsible for that amount. So the province has said, here's the total amount that municipal governments across Alberta would be able to incur on debt, and they would know what that number is, and I'm sure they manage it to accordingly. As you know, the fiscal debt of a country, and choose Canada in this case, has a federal portion, provincial portion, and ultimately a municipal portion. And I think, and I don't know the latest numbers, but in often cases, especially in federalist countries like ours, the provincial debt load will actually combined exceed that of the national debt load. And in some places, the provincial debt load will exceed that of the municipal debt load combined can exceed that of the provincial debt loads or state level debt loads. So I say that just for some background. The notion of the percentage debt loads being imposed, so to speak, on yourself. We do believe that to be inherently a political conversation amongst elected officials, amongst council, to ultimately come to a spot that they're comfortable with. For a point blank answer, I would not recommend that council puts a debt load on them, debt limit further to that of the provincial government, because I believe council needs to be examining each and every borrow for its impacts, its relevance, and all of the principles I believe the general manager spoke of right off the bat. And if it fits into all of those things, then council has that right, that authority, and the duty to vote accordingly. So I do think it can be a good check in place, or a balance point, or as the general manager indicated earlier, it does give you a barrier that if you need to, you can go through up to the higher level of the provincial imposed limit. But ultimately, it's a choice of council, it's a vote of council, whether it's being done across the board as a percentage lowering it, or one-on-one on any particular borrowing bylaw. I'll stop there, Your Worship. I'm not sure if that's clear or muddier, but it's a significant conversation to be had.
Okay. Thank you very much, Town Manager. Going back to Councilor Laurie.
Thank you, Your Worship. And yes, that provides the clarity that I was looking for there. Thank you to the Town Manager for that. I think that's exactly it. I think these fiscal sustainability strategy that we are looking at and these individual items are great because they are starting to bring to light those things that we need to consider and how carefully we need to look at these. So I hope when we see some of our debt borrowing bylaws come forward in the future, that they have a good analysis included with them as to how that's going to impact our current debt limit, our current debt servicing limit, what different options we have. I did just want to ask one more thing of the general manager in respect to the utility self-sustainability strategy that we are going to be seeing. When we talk about the potential utility debt that's upcoming, is that utility self-sustaining strategy meant to make utility self-sustaining in respect to borrowing, or is that strictly just operations?
Okay, thank you. General Manager?
Your worship, through to Councillor Laurie, it would include everything. So the principle there is that the utilities should stand alone and fund operations and debt, and the rate model should support that.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer, and we'll move on to Councillor, who has a hand up? Okay, Councillor Bennett, Deputy Mayor, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm referring to... Oh, sorry. I'm referring to page 8 of our package, and the section that talks about the Alberta capital. I'll just find it. The removal of the method of financing from the Alberta Capital Financing Authority. Is that going to impact us at all? Because I believe that some of our loans are with that program, and if the province is in the process of disbanding it, how is that going to affect us? And will it impact us in the future if we have to negotiate every single price rather than go to the same provincial body to get those loans?
Okay, that's a good question. Councillor Bennett, Deputy Mayor, go ahead to administrative staff.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through to Deputy Mayor Bennett. So what we understand from the province is that those existing debentures that we're holding through ACFA will remain. So they will continue to administer those until they come to expiration at the end of those terms. So there won't be any impact to the existing debt we're holding. And I like I said, I'm not totally sure how that will work with the province on going forward, but I also know that the commercial banks were getting very competitive with the rates the province was able to provide us in the past. So I really don't see a large impact to us going forward. But we'll continue to monitor sort of what the province is doing there, but I don't foresee anything with a large impact.
Your Worship, just a quick comment there as well. So previous experience in Saskatchewan, my time there, we had the same sort of provincial body that we could borrow from. For different reasons, we chose there to go to the banks, usually for more flexibility. And it was a common practice in Saskatchewan amongst the cities. And it does happen in Alberta as well. But it did get to a point, Your Worship, where part of our process there was to, literally put out RFPs for borrowing needs, at the beginning of the year or so on and so forth, and have almost a bid process for borrowing. Thank you, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you very much. Deputy Mayor, does that answer your question? Yes. Okay, thank you. Any other questions from members of council for clear understanding? No. Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for the presentation. And I'm going to move it to Councillor Mattis to make the motion, please.
Yes, that town council accept the debt management report for information.
Thank you very much, Councillor Matties. And now I'll open up the floor to members of council for questions, debate, and maybe suggestions to alter or change the proposed information that is set before us. Members of council, any questions? I do have a quick question for administrative staff. If you turn to page 32 of our agenda package, there's a list of other municipalities that have set a self-imposed debt limit. Edmonton is a little bit different because it does not just actually have a percentage of the debt limit, but it has a percentage of operating, I think. Just let me find that page. Page 32, 48. So I know with the city of Edmonton, it's a debt servicing cost is their internal limit and not actually the limit of the maximum borrowing. Would that be advantageous to the town of Stony Plain to have something like that versus a debt ceiling or self-imposed debt ceiling?
Your Worship, this is one that was interesting to administration, how they have put the limit on the debt servicing side, and they've actually broken it out between tax and total debt as well. So we have actually put this as a future sort of focus area within the fiscal sustainability to just understand what that could look like for the town into the future, and frame some of that out more. And maybe, the next round we bring the policy forward, we would potentially propose a ceiling on that servicing side. I think right now, we've just got sort of all the submissions for the corporate plan, and we're trying to understand what they look like and how we will fund those. But I think that it's a definite area to keep our eyes on, and it'll be interesting to see if some of the others in the region go that route as well. So I think, we have our eyes closely on that, and we'll be monitoring, and I would say would have this discussion again when it comes back to council. We've earmarked it as a future area to focus on.
Okay, thank you much, General Manager. Councillor Matties, you have a question?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going to refer to page 22. And under one purpose. And my question is, so I'll just read what it says: to establish financial guidelines and appropriate controls for the insurance and use of new debt and borrowing capacity for future capital assets, and then to limit the impact that debt servicing will have on future tax and utility rates. It says to ensure a favorable financial position. So my question is, to who? I mean, we're basically talking about limiting the impact with taxes and utility rates. How can we ensure a favorable financial position? And I guess with that, I'm asking, I wonder if that could be removed. So basically, so it would read, the second sentence would read, to limit the impact that debt servicing will have on future tax and utility rates while supporting the town's ability to meet current and future infrastructure challenges. So the question is, do we need that that portion of a sentence that says to ensure a favorable financial position?
Okay, thank you for your question. So administration staff, was there reasoning why it was worded that to ensure a favorable financial position?
Your Worship, through the Councillor Maddie, so this is just for information. We'll definitely take that into consideration. I think we could definitely look at that, and we'll bring back a revised proposal or a recommendation next meeting. But that's something for us to consider for sure.
Okay. And then may I just ask a question? So when that was written in there to ensure a favorable financial position, I'm guessing that means a favorable financial position for the town of Stony Plain. The town of Stony Plain has a history of having lower tax rates than municipalities around the capital region. Is that what is meant by having a favorable financial position?
I'm so sorry. I wasn't able to hear you, Mayor Choi, on that. But if somebody else could repeat that, and then I've got a second question.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Mattis. So my question was, with the words "to ensure a favorable financial position," was that written in there because the town of Stony Plain has had a history of having lower tax rates than the surrounding municipalities in the capital region? Is that why it was written in there, to maintain that tax advantage within the town of Stony Plain?
Okay, I think I've got what has been said. May I ask the second question?
Just to let the administration answer that question first.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry, thanks.
Your worship, that would be a piece of it for sure. It would be just ensuring that the debt servicing, doesn't overtake the expenditure. So it's balancing that ability to take debt, which we need to do to fund the infrastructure, but making sure that that's sustainable for residents. So I guess, that interpretation of that the tax rates remain reasonable for residents would be appropriate.
Okay. Thank you very much. Councillor Mattis?
Thank you. Yes, that's clear. I just wonder about the word favorable, in that we can't really ensure that. So just wanted to make that comment. My second question is regarding page 24 of 48. And it's with regards to the CAO responsibilities. Oh dear, hang on a second. Yes, the CAO, so that's 5-2-2. And C, and where it says the chief administrative officer or delegate is responsible for communicating to council any tax and or utility rate impacts and impact on debt limits. I'm wondering if we could also be updated on, in that same sentence, on existing capital priorities. So basically, potentially to read, the CAO is responsible for communicating to council any tax and or utility rate impacts and impact on debt limits and on existing capital priorities. So we can kind of see the whole package.
Okay, Councillor Mattis, administration, does that make sense to where it is, or is it more of a priorities conversation about where the projects are?
Your worship, through to Councillor Mattis. So I think that, but maybe tell me if I'm misunderstanding your question. I think that we do report this. It would be within the corporate plan. It would show our existing debt. So it shows sort of all the different debentures that we've borrowed for in the past, where we sit in relation to the limit, and then it shows the potential new debentures for council consideration for the upcoming 3 years. And then I think also, in some of the quarterly reporting, we report on some of the debt and the debt limits as well. We would follow the strategic plan of the capital priorities that council has set out in building that for the corporate plan.
Okay. Okay, so thank you. So Councillor Mattis, so
Yes.
that is built into the corporate planning process, and it's shown to council.
Yeah, I guess my comment is it would be just nice if it said that here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I have a question to administrative staff. It was raised a couple times by council regarding the ACFA, as mentioned by administration, that it is changing and folding and something else will come up and maybe replace it, maybe not. In this policy, it does not indicate where we can borrow from. So is there certain institutions that we want to borrow from, and are there certain institutions we do not want to borrow from? Such as under our investment policy, there are certain investments that we cannot purchase, and there are certain investments that we can, to safeguard the money that we have. Is there something that we could do here, or is it not worth noting?
Your Worship, I would say similar to what the town manager was commenting on previously, that it depends on the project that we would go out for debt, but there is a good chance that we'd go out to proposal to understand what the market is doing on those. And I think we're always very conservative in on all sides, so debt wouldn't be any different. That we would want to be using reputable companies and really understanding. And I'm assuming, that it's probably the large banks that would be the only ones that would be able to compete on some of the rates that the province is able to provide as well. So I'm comfortable not specifying in the policy. And I guess those would be my reasons why.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? More comments? Okay. So members of the council, I've gone through this a couple times, and I'm in favor of having a self-imposed internal limit in terms of what we can borrow. Let us lower the MGA limit. The way that I operate my business and operate my household, just because I have a credit card doesn't mean I can max it out or should max it out each and every time. I have a self-imposed restriction myself, so that there is room in that credit department that if emergency does come up, as mentioned by Councillor Matties, well, we can't plan for everything. What if we have a huge cave-in and 3/4 of our roads get sunken in through a big sinkhole? Well, that's not planned. That is unforeseen. So, but if we don't have that kind of cushion, then if we're already, as town council, used up to our debt limit, we can't borrow any more money to fix that or do those repairs. So if we have a self-imposed limit, we can operate the town of Stony Plain within that limit, and then that excess, that, for example, if we put a 75% ceiling on that, that means it'll leave us 25% for unforeseen and emergent issues that arise that council has not been apprised of or we're not worried about. Like if something happens and there's an earthquake here, and we're at our full maximum limit, we cannot borrow money to fix and do those repairs. So personally, I would like to see a limit of about 75%. Thoughts from members of council? Councillor Laurie?
Thank you, Your Worship. And while I agree with your premise in what you're saying is that, we do have to be responsible and make sure that we are prepared for emergencies, etc., I think we are constantly going to be faced with planned and unplanned needs to borrow. Emergencies are unfortunately inevitable. We will see that. We will have urgent needs that come forward that weren't identified prior. And I think it is more prudent for us to manage those on a case-by-case-by-case basis when we decide on every borrowing bylaw that comes in front of us, rather than essentially saying, hey, you know what, we're good. Anything comes before us, let's borrow all the way up to 75%, and then we've got that 25% cushion. I think our intention should be to always keep our ratios as low as possible. And I don't think that that needs to be defined by a benchmark in a policy by putting one number on the board. I also then look at, when you talk about those limits, what happens if we have an emergency borrow that we go ahead, or that we're required to move forward with, and how does that start to impact our borrowing further? Do we have that discussion about planned borrows that were already in place before the emergency and decide whether to move forward with those borrows or not? Or are all of those borrows automatically canceled because now we're over our self-imposed limit, even though we might be under a provincial limit? And I think all that limit, putting that cap on there does, is just causes us to have an extra conversation to one that we would already be having anyways. We will always be discussing what borrowing certain dollars and certain debentures will do and what that will mean for our municipality. I would almost go to the opposite side and say, if we were to put a limit on our self-imposed limit on our debt borrowing is that we don't have confidence in ourselves or in our administration that we can control our borrowing. So I'm not in favor of putting a limit on this. We have limits already. We have limits imposed. And to your analogy of using your credit card, I'm the exact same way. Just because you have that limit does not mean you're spending to it. Each and every decision about borrowing will come in front of council, and we will need to have a proper discussion around that. Putting that limit in, to me, signals that we're not really going to discuss it until we get to that limit. So, just my thoughts.
Thank you, Councilor Laurie, and that appreciate your comments. However, that putting a self-imposed limit on does not mean that council waives all say until we hit that limit. Each and every borrowing bylaw will come to council for debate and consideration before we approve anything. That is, anything above that needs to be an emergent and unforeseen matter. Is the gist of it. It's not that we need to say 75%, administration can do whatever they want, up to 75%. Anything more than that, then they have to come to council. That's what I heard. Okay. Councillor Laurie?
And I will clarify, that is not what I am saying at all, Your Worship.
But that's what,
I am not saying
said.
that we won't. I'm saying that every single item, council will already have that discussion. So what purpose does that limit serve?
Right. Councillor Matties, go ahead. Councillor Matthews?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I do support having a limit of 75% or 80%. I think that's just a good top line that helps us to provide some guidance and responsible debt management, knowing that the government of Alberta is setting a overall guideline for all municipalities that does not reflect ours. And that would be noted in that 10 out of 12 other communities chose to have a lower limit than what the government of Alberta is placing. Secondly, I don't think good intentions are always going to provide good results. So I do think that it is good to have those types of guidelines in place. I still think that we need to review case by case, and I do think we need to keep our eye on the ball in terms of not having too much debt, what's affordable for our community, and making sure that we're responsible in terms of governance. But I do support having a limit.
Thank you, Councillor Matthews. Councillor Loy?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I agree with yourself, and I agree with Councillor Matthews, and I also agree with Councillor Laurie, too, with his comments are there. The province has set this up really to protect themselves as well, because if a municipality goes down, they are the ones that inherit that debt. So they have to look at the whole, every municipalities within their province. That's a good idea. I think what we are saying to our taxpayers is that, yeah, we know we can go there, but we would like to just put one more check in front of that. So therefore we're saying we'll go here. However, there will be occasions, like as Councillor Laurie said, and I can think of a few that are coming down the pike, that we may end up having to go more because we're going to be forced. We can delay projects until the cows come home, as in building arenas. The last one here is 1967. We haven't done one. But there comes a time when you still have to operate through that emergency thing. Yeah, there'll be emergencies that'll be covered off by the province. Earthquake probably is one, and massive floods is another. But some things that we know that are occurring within our town that we're going to have to deal with may require some borrowing. And we will address those, or every council will address those as they come in front of them. So I am in favor of this self-imposed. I think it just shows that we are taking this seriously and shows our taxpayers that we are on top of this. So.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Loy. Moving over to Deputy Mayor. Go ahead, Councillor Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to be clear, we do have, at this point, a self-imposed limit of 80%. Am I correct there?
No, I threw out the idea of maybe 75%.
Okay. So, but right now, we do have 80%.
Right now, we have 0. So right now, our limit is the MGA limit. So whatever the MGA says is our limit.
Oh, no, I thought that when we did this platform the last time, we did set a self-imposed limit, and I would be in favor of that. That's just the caution sign, and once we reach that limit, then to me, any emergencies after that, we should have planned for and taken care of in the first 75%. But overall, with this report that we've had, I'll tell you what I've learned with my credit card. And that is that no matter what the limit is, it doesn't matter what the limit is, I have to be able to pay it back. And if I can't pay it back, it doesn't matter how high the limit is. So that's the thing that I liked about this report, is the checks and balances that are in it, the overall picture of the best practices and the MGA and the balancing act that's happening. And so when it comes to this report that we've just had, I thought it was really well done, and it's something that makes me feel very secure in knowing that our administration has that picture in mind.
Thank you, Councilor Bennett. Any other questions or comments from members? Okay, Councilor Meyer, go ahead.
Which one am I
No, that
talking
one.
into? This one here? So I guess maybe I should have asked administration a question or two. But just to add to the conversation, you know, and I don't detract from anything that anybody's already said, but I would argue that the town of Stony Plain is not necessarily like our credit cards, and you know, debt is a little bit different with town. We use it to get people who are going to use the borrowing is usually for capital projects, and those capital projects are usually used by people immediately once they're built, and we want to collect money from those people so that they pay for the things that they're using. So I guess that's not a great explanation of what I'm trying to drive at, but I don't think debt is necessarily a bad thing for the town to incur. Although I do appreciate everybody's points here, you know, it is important to be prudent with debt. And so what I would maybe sort of be leaning towards is maybe a 75% limit is a touch on the too prudent. I would sort of recommend that we look at what the administration had put before us, looking at the 80%. I appreciate that in emergencies, yes, you might want to fall onto, you know, the credit card to cover the need. But as Councillor Loy had mentioned, if there is a major emergency, we can expect outside help, and we wouldn't incur all of those, you know, costs. So I think putting aside 25% of our borrowing limit for a potential emergency might be a little bit on the higher side. Although, like I say, I do appreciate the thoughts of being prudent. So that's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Councillor Meyer, and I agree with you. Debt is not a bad thing, especially if it's used properly in terms of building our community and going forward so that our residents have kind of amenities to use. I think the self-imposed limit is not a stop dead limit. That way, once we hit that limit, we don't do anything else in our communities. It is to give council a second sobering look at it. Says, you know what, your policy says you're at this limit, which is could be 75, could be 80%. We are now going to be going over this with your next project or 2 projects. Is that something that the town can handle, and is that something that the council is kind of comfortable with? Councilor Pletchko.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. As I sit here this evening listening to everybody refer to credit cards and debt and all kinds of stuff, I sit here wondering how prudence becomes 70% and 80% or what it does, or sets off a trigger that makes us wonder if or what we should be doing. We today have a number of projects that have been put aside for years by past council and administration. And today we have multiple things within our community that need to be addressed. And each one of them things as they come to us in council are important for the movement of our citizens within our community. Now, having something that sets a trigger, each of those things should set a trigger in our own minds, not a number that says when we get to 50 or 70 or 80% is going to make us stop and think of whether we should continue to do this or not do this. What we need to consider is what is in the best interest of our community that we can afford to do, that's prudent, that takes in the best interest of each and every taxpayer within our community. So by setting limits, I'm not sure that that takes all that into consideration, because the government, as Councillor Loy pointed out, at some point in time, whether we're prudent or we're not prudent, the limits that we're allowed to do could mean that the province takes our community over. Now, none of us take the chair today or in the future, I'm sure, to run our community into that situation. And I think that's what we really have to consider today is putting a number there, whether it's 50, 70, or 80%, I think really is irrelevant. What is relevant is that administration looks at each project that needs to be done, and there's multiple within our community that need to be done. So we set a number today, and 4 months from now, we're back in council looking for a new number because we're over it. So that number, I think I would caution what that number is. I support that we look to the future of our community and what we can and can't afford. And it's not necessarily what we as council can afford, it's what our ratepayers can afford. And I think each one of them, when it comes time for us to be deciding projects, is based on what our ratepayers can afford. And if we can't afford, or we don't feel that they can afford a large tax increase, then that puts that project on hold regardless. So having that number for me, I'm not sure I clearly understand that today. Each council out there today that has a number is currently reviewing that number because they all know that they're all in a bad situation where they're going to have to go above it. So why are we picking a number that really, inside of a year or 6 months, who knows what that number is, we could be back here at this table doing that, where today we have no number, and each project we do, I believe each and every one of us in this council chambers is prudent with what we do for our community.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Councilor Pletchko. So I've talked to those municipalities that do have a self-imposed limit, and I've only heard one that may be revisiting it because it was so low. The other ones are not, because that they have the proper balances in place, policies to check in. I think the only person that, according to that, was 50%, which I think is extremely low to how it is done at the present time. So members of council, I think there was some conversation about yes and maybe 1 or 2 no's. So administration, do you need a direction from this, or did you guys get enough to kind of hear the feedback, maybe make some alterations to the policy, the debt management policy, and come back to council on the 13th?
Your worship, it's a CAO. I think the best course of action is just that we will prepare the written policy and provide council with, the written format, so to speak, to, formally debate and approve or not changes to the self-imposed debt limit. So the policy in and of itself would be the same, but we would have the opportunity or the format that council would follow to make any changes on that item.
Okay, so from my understanding is that on the 13th, when it comes back, the policy is the same. Then there'd be like a second motion after the initial motion to, if council wants to make that motion, is to add a self-imposed limit. Is that correct?
Yeah, Your Worship, we can provide that. Likely right inside the RFD where there's, options for council or I forget the terminology, but yeah, basically yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation. I think Councillor Matties had made the motion to accept information, so I'm just going to call all those opposed to accepting for information. Okay, seeing none, that is carried. Moving on to 5.2 is the cash management and investment. Go ahead, administration.
Thank you, Your Worship. So again, related to our fiscal sustainability strategies, the cash management investment is another prong within that framework. So we did have our current investment brokers, Wood Gundy, come and present to council on June 1st, which I hope was useful to council and just understanding, a reminder again of the MGA requirements, as well as sort of their projection into the future on the economy and how we manage our investment portfolio. We have proposed in front of council tonight a few minor changes to our investment policy. Most are fairly minor wording changes, and the only other advice we got from the investment manager was around the portfolio performance. We had referenced in the past Government of Canada bond rates, and they suggested because those are changing so frequently that is maybe not the best benchmark. So we're going to work with them to just track that, report better to council on some indices, and again, just get better at that and keep reporting back to council on that. The other piece we've included for council tonight is just the strategy that would form part of the fiscal sustainability framework on page 44. Is the investment strategy, which, because it is so legislated of what we can invest in through the MGA, is, I think, fairly straightforward. And, the policy really speaks to how we're managing cash and that it's invested prudently, which I think that we are doing, and the investment managers are doing a good job around that. So I think this one's a little bit more straightforward because there's less council direction needed, but I know this policy, not all council has had opportunity to comment on the past, so could answer any questions on the policy or the framework strategies going forward. But that's all that I have to present to you on this one tonight.
Okay. Thank you much, General Manager. So members of council, you've had the cash management investment policy in front of you. Any questions or comments regarding clarity or understanding on that policy? Okay, Councillor Meyer, go ahead.
Thank you, through you to administration. Just on page 42, down at 5.3, when it talks about reporting, does periodic mean something like an actual time frame? Because quarterly, I know. Periodic, what is that? Like just what is a period? 3 months?
Good. I think it's supposed to be yearly, if I read the thing properly. Is that correct, administration?
Your Worship, through to Councillor Meyer. So this was a little bit, because we do report quarterly on the investment holdings in aggregate, but some of the effective, so on number 2, it speaks that we'll report on the effective rate of return on the portfolio. So that we would not be able to report on quarterly. It would be more on an annual basis. So for the policy, that's why the wording has been changed to periodic.
Okay, so just for my understanding, periodic doesn't actually reference a particular amount of days. It's basically when everything comes in and you can present it in a meaningful way.
Your Worship, through to Councillor Meyer, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for clarity and understanding? Okay, Councillor Matties, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question on the same page, page 42 of 48, with regards to it's 5-3 reporting and the town manager's reporting. And we did take out the specific holdings within the investment portfolio, and I agree with that. I don't need to know the specific holdings in the investment portfolio, but I did truly appreciate having that nice pie chart that described what the asset allocation was. And so I'm asking if where it says they will report on the total assets within the investment portfolio, if it could say total assets and asset allocation of the investment portfolio, only because it just makes it very clear that it's important, because if it was all principal protected notes, I'd be quite concerned. But because I know there's some bonds and there's principal protected notes, then I feel that, I mean, I understand that the portfolio is balanced and diversified.
Okay, so administration, is that a wordsmithing that can easily be done, or is it an issue?
No, Your Worship, we could definitely make that change. We'll add the asset allocation to that reporting piece.
And I have one more comment, if I could, Mayor Choi.
Go ahead, Councillor Mattis.
Thank you. Oh gee, I think it's on page 39. Let me just tell you what page it's on. Yes, on page 40. It is section 4-0 cash management, and then under 4-1, the very last paragraph, it uses the word on a very infrequent basis. I'm not sure what that means, but what I was hoping it meant was when determined necessary on a limited basis, where operating or capital funds have been invested and the timing of the projected cash need changes, the town may access a line of credit to maximize the net yields. I don't know if the on a very infrequent basis tells me something, but if we could say if it's determined necessary and on a limited basis, is that what we're trying to say?
Okay, good question, administration.
Your Worship, through to Councillor Matties, yes, that is what we're trying to say. So we could look at the wording around that. I think, this is the first time that I'm aware of that the town's, actually looked at more seriously at the operating line of credit, and definitely exceptional circumstances around that. So we could maybe tweak the wording on, instead of on a very infrequent basis, change that so it's clearer.
Okay, and I just
Thank
have
you.
that's a good comment from Councillor Mattis and good answer. But I do caution the word, like, I like to see something that's limited there, or very infrequent, because I kind of caution the town using this kind of philosophy to operate on, and then not using proper planning of our cash needs, and then using our line of credit instead all the time. So I don't want it to be frequent. Does that make sense?
Yes, Your Worship, it does.
Okay. Any other questions for understanding and clarity? Okay, seeing none. Thank you for your presentation, administration, and I'm going to ask Councillor Meyer to make the motion, please.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. The Town Council accept the cash management and investment management report for information.
Thank you very much for the motion, Councillor Meyer. Members of council, any questions or comments regarding that motion? Okay. See none, I'll call all those that are opposed to accepting this for information. See that no one is opposed, that is carried. Thank you, administration staff, for those two reports. They were very well done and very informative for members of council, and hopefully the public had a chance to actually read through them as well. Moving on to our agenda items is council information and council discussion. Anything that council would like to bring to attention of other councillors or just to our public? We'll start with Councillor Matties.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a few things that I'd like to share this evening. First of all, I wanted to mention on June 22nd, or sorry, from June 26th, so it was on the 24th, I had the opportunity to join our CAO and yourself with the Edmonton Global and Town of Stony Plain. We were basically looking at how to help Edmonton Global build an investment case. And they were asking us to provide opportunities for Edmonton Global, some of the information and service gaps that could be addressed, and other information that could help inform the development of the investment case. And so we gained some very good information at that meeting, and I just wanted to share a couple of those things. First of all, with regards to information gaps, what was apparent was the need for greater clarity regarding the strengths of our region, our competitive areas. And the two individuals from Edmonton Global, one was Lynette Tremblay, Vice President of Strategy and Innovation, and the other was Mustafa Saham, who was the Vice President of Investment and Trade. And they shared some of our competitive areas. One was the industrial heartland, and they said it's a key competitive area known worldwide. They also talked about our egg and plant protein. They had suggested that, for example, in India, there are 750 million people in a specific target market, vegetarian, that require more food. They spoke of us having a very good brand, that the maple leaf is attuned to honest, natural, and pure. And they also talked about artificial intelligence in the areas of healthcare, manufacturing, agriculture, autonomous farming, food processing. They also spoke of the challenges that we're dealing with. One is that most of our companies are SMEs, or small to medium-sized companies, and that we need to scale up. So we need to become global companies, and we need to have our federal and provincial governments really working collaboratively with us to support that global focus of our companies. They also said that one of our challenges is that we're just too honest as Canadians, that other countries aren't as honest with regards to, for example, what the food content is versus how we present that. And secondly, they said that the challenges is with regards to Edmonton Global funding, that they need more seed money from the provincial and federal governments to support the initiatives for us to move forward. What was very interesting to me was that Lynette Tremblay, she basically, because I was asking about, well, is there not 2 or 3 areas that we could just really focus on as our strengths and that we could all agree on as a region? And she said it's not about focusing on areas that we all agree on. It's that the data will tell us what to focus on. She said it's market intelligence is critical to determine the key areas of strength. The research then backs that up and then tells us it's good to proceed. So it was very interesting to hear that, and I know they're going to bring back that with regards to their business case or their investment case. So that was my first item. Second item, I had an opportunity to meet briefly with the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce. And we've been meaning to get together at some point just to have coffee. And so we finally made that happen. And we talked about the business community. We know that 80% of the businesses are not back to pre-COVID levels. And we talked about how does our community work together to attract businesses downtown. We came up with some ideas, discussed ideas like outdoor patios, of course, local buy local campaigns, which we already have and are doing very well in our community, but also with regards to online and e-commerce to increase sales inside and outside of the community. And we also talked about some of the business needs that our business owners have with regards to technology needs, public speaking in terms of how to market yourself and your value proposition. We talked about social media support, and we talked about personal protective equipment. For example, when you walk into a Best Buy, my husband was there recently, he had his mask on, and every salesperson was wearing a mask. And he said most of the people in the store were wearing a mask. And he said that immediately increased his comfort level. And so we need to maybe consider that in the community, what is required. And then Sarah had provided an excellent summary of and some reference information that I forwarded on to our CAO. My third item was summer sessions. I thoroughly enjoyed the first two summer sessions online. It was nice to sit down on a Wednesday evening and listen to the tunes. And finally, Canada Day, it was absolutely great to deliver some flags in the community. And I know that it was well received by all of the neighborhoods that I had delivered. And my final note is this is just a concern that I have noticed. I've been walking the trails, and between High Park and John Paul School, we have the stormwater pond there. We also have the creek, and I have never seen the creek as full it is right now. It's moving on into the trees, and also there's the large pond that somehow has developed over the last year or two. That is the southeast corner of the school where that new development is proposed. And there is so much water there. And again, it's backing very close onto the trail and into the trees. So I just was wondering if administration could comment on that, please.
Okay, so thank you, Councilor Mattis. That was 5, if I was counting correctly. Uh, If we can just have a quick comment on the current, I think the entire town is very, very saturated.
Your worship, it's CAO here. I'm not able to hear you really well, so I'll just provide some comment on the final question, I guess, from Councillor Mattis. I think the most I can say at this point to Councillor Mattis and to the rest of the council is, we can have some staff go and take a look to see if there's anything of significant concern that they have with the way things are operating out there. While at the same time, I can ask of staff if there's anything that we've done or not done or are doing in that particular area. Your worship, at this point, I'm not personally aware of what the situation is there, but we can endeavor to find out.
Yeah, thank you very much and appreciate that. Yes, there's, with the amount of rain that we've had over the last couple of years, a lot of our ponds are higher than we've ever seen in the last probably about 10, 15 years. And it might be something that we can consider. Maybe there's nothing that we can do because everything else is saturated. But we appreciate the staff taking a look at those areas. Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Laurie, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple things to mention. You started off with it in this meeting, and as the chair of the social side of the Mayor's Task Force, I'd just like to extend a big thank you out, not only to council, but to all the volunteers and staff that participated in the Canada Day flag distribution. It was an absolutely wonderfully well-received touch to the community, and a huge thanks to our sponsors who helped sponsor those flags for us. A couple of things that I wanted to bring up that I've had brought up to me. Number one is the 16A and Veterans Boulevard intersection. It seems Alberta Transportation came through and did a whole lot of repairs on Highway 16A, and they seem to have completely skipped that intersection, particularly coming into Stony Plain. So if you're heading westbound, turning southbound from 16A onto Veterans Boulevard, there are some extremely sizable potholes there. And I was hoping when they were in the area doing the repairs that that intersection was going to be fixed, and it was not. Even though less than 100 feet down the road, there's some significant repairs that were undertaken. So I'm just hopeful administration can reach out to AT and make sure that that is brought back up. Also, with the construction on 779, I've had 4 different phone calls and a couple of messages from residents who are having issue with the garbage collection. I know there was notices sent around, and I know that the contractors are responsible for moving the bins both to and from the collection site, but it appears that the contractors are not necessarily doing that in a timely fashion. Some residents' bins seem to have gone completely missing. Other residents' bins are coming back to them and they are still full. So I'd just like to make sure administration follows up and addresses that with the contractor and the residents and ensures that they are receiving the adequate services. The last thing is I noticed just before our meeting started, we did get an update on the spray park stating that we are working very hard on getting that open as soon as possible for our residents with a target of somewhere near the end of this week, beginning of next. However, I did want to ask administration if they can provide some commentary because I've heard some very negative commentary in respect to Spruce Grove Spray Park at Jubilee Park and the fact that it is limited to Spruce Grove residents only, requires it to be booked in advance, and has a significant or a short time limit placed on that as to how long somebody's allowed to spend at the spray park. So can administration just comment in respect to our spray park as to whether we are looking at those restrictions as well in the opening and restricting that to Stony Plain residents only, forcing them to book it online and imposing a time limit? Or are we going to open it as per usual with similar to what we're doing at the skate park, signage advising our residents as to what the expected rules and regulations are for that facility?
Your worship, I can provide a bit of comment there. I don't know that I would call it a definitive answer. Yeah, we had a bit of a conversation this morning regarding the skate park itself. And as I see, our general manager has provided a brief update to council there. I don't know, I personally don't know the regulations or rules that City of Spruce Grove has put in place. I believe the City of Edmonton's would be considered on the looser side of that. I know in some of the conversation we had this morning, we were, I believe, moving a little bit closer to the looser side of the regulatory regulations regarding use of the splash park. Some of it can be a little bit different depending on the water and if it's being treated or not, and so on and so forth. But Your Worship, I'll stop there. I believe our intent is to I don't know that I've been made aware of any conversation about restricting use based on, place of residence. I don't know that I had heard any conversation about booking specific times and so on and so forth. I can check in again tomorrow and provide council some further commentary that way, but I don't believe that's the direction we were going, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you very much for the update. Thank you for the questions and comments, Councillor Laurie. Moving to Councillor Lloyd, please.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Just really one topic here. I've been noticing on social media some people complaining about the state of our town, mainly like our grass and stuff like that. I drove around and I really don't find it in as great a disrepair as I am seeing on social media. I know that our staff has been cut back a wee bit because of the COVID, so I want to commend them for doing the job that they're doing. But when I drove around and I walked around and I did the trails and biked and stuff like that over the last several days, I really noticed that a lot of our private residences are really not maintaining their properties. There's just lots of lawns out there that are just full of clover and stuff like that, haven't been mowed for a significant period of time. There was talk about communities in bloom. It was a great thing quite a few years back. I'm just wondering through to administration, through our social media, if we can maybe kind of do a campaign of some sort to remind people to look after their properties and mow and do things, because it needs it. It's just my personal opinion. And it's not the town properties. They're really looked after. It's just more to try to generate this self-pride in homes and stuff like that to get that back up to scratch. Other than that, it's still a marvelous town.
Thank you, Councilor Lloyd, for those comments, and I think administration heard that, so they'll look at maybe a couple ways that we can kind of spread the message out, but not as in you need to do this, because I think then everybody starts pointing fingers at everybody. So I think the messaging should be, as you mentioned, just to showcase our community and all that stuff.
Exactly, Your Worship. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Pletchko, please.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Just want to commend the town on the work projects that are going on, especially the one downtown and on our 779 projects. They're moving ahead well. Had a chance to be downtown the other day and talk to some of the local business people down there who seem to be all right with what's going on. They seem to be in the know and pleased to see that there's production happening. On a downside note, I'm just wondering on 628, there's now a new dump site along there just shy of Range Road 11. Heavy equipment traffic on that road, people backing on and off the road, no signs, no flag people. And I'm wondering if administration is aware of that project that's going on and if that's approved. That road is not in the greatest of condition at the best of times, and with the big dump trucks hauling fill dirt to the land along there, it's created quite a mess along there. And I'm wondering if there's anything that can be done to ensure that that keeps clean. There's some signs put up and posted so that people do know that it's a cautionary area, especially when it's raining out there. The mud and the clay that's on the highway is getting to be astronomical out there.
Okay, thank you very much, Councilor Pletchko. So maybe the question for administration is to respond back to council is, does that property have a haul permit for doing what they
Still
do?
have one thing.
Right, is that you're looking for a haul permit?
Well, I'm looking for a haul permit. Yes, that's what I'm looking for.
Okay.
And the other thing that I'm wondering about is I've noticed no work being done at the John Paul II road, and I'm wondering if we could have a bit of an update as to that road that goes into John Paul II, especially if the new construction is going to shut that off, as to when that's going to start to take place.
Okay, thank you. Can
Your Worship, to the rest of council, yeah, I can make a few comments on that. Again, our general manager of planning infrastructure is actually on a couple of days off here. So as for 628 or Range Road 11, I believe was the site. I'm not aware, but typically, I mean, anything of any sort of substantial movement of fill or earth or clay or whatever it may be does require some form of a haul permit within the town boundaries. So what I can do is I can just ask staff if there is one, if we're aware of it, if we're not, what's going on, what isn't. I'm not aware of it, so I would have to just ask that, and I can provide that to councils for information to make sure that everything's above board there. Frankly, Your Worship, I'll go a little bit further. The vast majority of contractors are pretty good about the haul permits, but frankly, some are not. And every once in a while, we do have to backtrack on someone that didn't notify us they were going to be doing one thing or the other. And I just say that in a general perspective. I'm not aware of who's doing what out there on as Councillor Pletchko has indicated. Second question is a very relevant consideration, the notion of the access into John Paul II. We would have to check in with AT and their and Wells, so to speak, as to their timing of that. And I can get a little more detailed update, both for my own purposes, but also for councils. I am aware that I believe a decent chunk of the underground and service work was all completed, and they are. You're looking at road work and sidewalk, curb and gutter, and all that sort of stuff through this year. I do know that AT has. would say that, they're a little bit behind already. There's some, rain and so on and so forth. They have a lot of time to make that up. But that service road is critical in that the way the design is to enter and exit John Paul II, it relies on that service road. So long answer, short question, Your Worship. We'll check that out, and I can provide an update to council in relatively short order this week.
Okay, thank you. And I drive through that intersection every day, and there is some mistakes, and it looks like there is some grading that's happening on that road. So I would hope that it would be done within the next month or so before the summer's over. Councilor Fletcher, you had another comment?
Yeah, just in regards to the dump site, a sign went up on, it's actually just before Range Road 11. It's on the north side of the road. A sign went up that said, looking for clean fill. And there's been trucks going in and out of there ever since. So that's why I'm wondering about the haul permit.
That's good. Thank you.
Sure.
Councilor Meyer?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll be brief. First, I'd like to, sorry, which one am I talking into?
This one.
This one here. First, I'd like to tip my hat to the economic stream of the Mayor's Task Force. The opportunity to plant flags in people's yards with my children and some of my wife's stay-home kids was a good opportunity to practice a little patriotism, and it was a learning opportunity for the kids as well. So thank you very much. I think that was a terrific idea. And then I did hear the CAO talk about weather and construction, and that our public works manager is currently not with us this evening to comment on that, but I did hear him say they do have time to make up the delays. I hope as the season continues, if we do continue to see delays, that council is kept abreast of that. But otherwise, the only, I've been quiet the last couple of weeks when it comes to council discussions, so I really searched hard for one to come to council this evening, and it's more just an observation about our fine park on Brown Street, which I do believe got upgraded a number of years ago. But if anyone does notice, it is very rarely used. There are a number of parks that, in my opinion, aren't nearly as good, that are nearby, that do draw people's attention, and I think the big difference is places to sit. There's nowhere for, you can show up with your kids, they can go play on the park. Sorry, you can show up with your kids and they can go play on the park, which you rarely see because I think the parents are reluctant to go to a park where there is nowhere for them to sit. So I know that's an issue with Brown Street. I would be curious if other parks were also lacking sitting benches for adults. Anyhow, just that for a discussion item. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Thank you. So I think Councilor Meyer was just asking about our parks and if there's benches at all our parks for people to sit at as adults to kind of visit and talk while the kids are playing. So I think if next time administration's out and about doing the park inspections, if they can actually note that as well. Thank you. Councillor Bennett, please.
Deputy Mayor, if you don't
Deputy Mayor,
mind.
go ahead.
Now
you
I
are.
remember I am, so you're going to hear it. Mr. Mayor, one of the things about being last on the list is that everyone else has said the list of things that I was going to comment on. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor, and you know how I feel after any conversations and discussion points. Okay, members of council, thank you very much. And again, I'd just like to say thank you very much for everybody that was involved in the Canada Day celebrations. If you did not have a chance to watch the Canada Day virtual celebrations online through the 8 municipalities that were partnered between Beaumont, Devon, ourselves, Spruce Grove, Strathmore County, St. Albert, and who else? And Fort Saskatchewan, I believe. There's 8 of us. That was a great collaboration between the municipalities around this area to provide a show for our residents. And some of that live entertainment was fantastic. Is it ever similar to our summer sessions? It was done at a theater where there was nobody in there, and it was just live streamed, so it was excellent done. Appreciate that. Members of council, thank you very much for taking the time to read your agenda packages and come up with questions and comments and discussion. Administration, thank you for your work. With that, before I close, can I just have an update from the general manager regarding the opening of our facilities, as mentioned by Councillor Lowry, that we just received the email regarding the opening of the spray park. But how are we doing with the provincial health orders and opening up other facilities, such as ball diamonds, et cetera, et cetera? Thank you. Town manager, is our general manager of Community Protective Services on?
No, Your Worship, he's not, and I apologize, but it's cutting in and out a little bit for me, so I'm missing some of the dialogue here.
Okay, so just if we can get an update of where we're at with the opening of our other facilities, et cetera. I think you guys did that a little while ago. If you can just, again, update us again in terms of sports fields, the swimming pool, if that's going to happen, spray park, just again, just remind council again in terms of the skate park and what we're doing there, the BMX track and the partnership with the BMX Association, et cetera.
Okay. We can do that via email if that's what you're looking for, Your Worship, or even a little bit further detail on the 13th.
Yeah, on the 13th, it'd be excellent as well. So that way that our residents are fully aware of some of the restrictions and the complexities that our staff have to deal with into opening facilities, et cetera. Okay, thank you very much. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.